Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this fourth dialogue within the Rebalance project. We are pleased to have two panelists today to help us discuss a very hot topic of the future of the car. So let me first of all introduce our two panelists today. Stefan Gössling is a professor at the Department of Service Management and Service Studies at Lund University, and also at the School of Business Economics at the Kalmar, the Linnaeus University. He's been working for over 25 years on transportation and mobility issues, with a specific focus on transport economics, behavior, and policies. So welcome, Stefan. Jens Schade is a psychologist by training, and he is currently associate professor in traffic and transport psychology at the Technische University of Dresden, and has been working for almost 2 decades on psychological questions and issues associated to mobility and traffic behavior, including acceptance of technological innovation and challenges to be addressed to change people's mobility decisions and behavior towards sustainability, of course, and a safer transport system. So welcome, Jens. Just a few words for those of you who are new to this exercise about the project. Rebalance project is a research project funded by Horizon 2020, the European Framework Program for Research and Innovation. It is a foresight project, so the whole spirit of the exercise is to look forward and to try to go beyond the short-term horizon that characterizes, unfortunately, very often policy decisions. Of course, there are plenty of other foresight studies in the transport sector which have been conducted over the past years and decades. So I think it's important to try and underline what is, and we hope is, the originality of the rebalance exercise, because in rebalance, what we would like to address is the role of deeply ingrained values and cultural features of transport users and transport stakeholders in general, which in a way are somehow upstream the immediate decision on and behavioral choices, which are often implicit and at times not even a conscious and clearly identified trait of character. So that's our challenge. It's not easy, but at the end we would like to build scenarios that are based on what we usually call critical uncertainties, to be found in that upstream area, those factors that are cultural and related to ethics and to values, and that end up by shaping more visible behavior and choices. So an interesting challenge, I think. We've had already 3 interesting discussions in the past weeks with other experts and panelists. We have selected originally a set of 5 main topics for these discussions, and today's topic is the future role of the car. Vaste programme, would say the French. It is indeed a challenge which is not new, but which is heavily constrained by precisely a number of factors, which are not immediately amenable to short-term changes in policy decisions, and we would like to investigate the roots of these aspects and challenges. So in fact, we know that, and I think everybody agrees now, that the use of private car has significant negative impacts on environment, on health, on safety, and on top of that, it generates congestion. It consumes a lot of space, especially in the urban environment, and we could say that it overall has a significant impact on quality of life. if we relate it to all sorts of inconveniences associated to moving with a private car. Of course, there are a number we have been witnessing and are still witnessing a number of initiatives which at the policy level and at the operational level are trying to address the negative impacts of the car-based culture, I would say, and to nudge and steer people towards a more sustainable means of transport. This includes, of course, access regulation in cities, the initiatives to foster active mobility, and to make, to enhance and upgrade public transport in order to make it more attractive and steer people away from the private car of use. But do we really believe that this is enough? That's a rhetorical question as far as I'm concerned. Basically because private car ownership is so deeply ingrained in our culture, in our civilization, that something more than nudges and short-term measures is needed. Incidentally, car sales keep growing worldwide. Significantly. I think the last figure was an 8% increase year on year last year, which is far from negligible. So it is clearly an area where the current initiatives, as good as they are not enough if we really aim at changing the culture and steering people away from cars. So the basic question is, but do we believe it is realistic to envisage a future where a radical move away from cars would actually happen to such extent that the environment, health, and quality of life of people would be visibly changed? And if so, what are the key values that we have to promote in order to achieve it? So that's the framework of our discussion today, which I will try to boil down to a number of more specific questions. Let me start with the first one, which has to do with the freedom. Now, freedom, a very nice word, everybody uses a lot. The starting point of my question is that there is a generalized belief that driving a car is an expression of freedom. Why so? Because the driver is, or believes he or she is in control, and therefore can decide where, when, at what speed, and with what itinerary to move around. But one may wonder whether this is not, at least to some extent, a delusion, an illusion, when you think of of congestion and frustrating episodes which you cannot control, or the time losses associated to longer travel times to find parking spots, or what happens when somebody who you cannot control is the originator of accidents that you are a passive recipient of. Not forgetting the high economic cost of driving a car, both in terms of ownership of the car itself and in terms of running it around. So my question is this what I would call the agency factor, that is the factor that corresponds to the feeling of being in control, of being the actor and being the decision maker? Is this a really fundamental determinant for people when they decide how to move around? And if so, maybe one can wonder whether more evidence and better evidence of the real and fully fledged costs and benefits, both individual and at the societal level, could help somehow deconstructing this current paradigm, this current belief in the power of agency, and therefore convince people that their real need is to move. It's not to drive, but it's to move. So let me open the discussion on this first topic. Stefan, would you like to start?
Sure can. Yes, it's a complex question. I think what you're touching upon is different definitions of freedom that we could bring forward. I mean, one you mentioned is economic freedom. You have to have an income. The car is really expensive. We just finished some calculations that hopefully will be published in 2 months, where we show that for a low income household, you actually invest almost as much as you invest in your housing in your car, because it is so costly for people with a limited income, and that despite the car already being subsidized. You talked about the inconveniences of the car. I mean, in many European countries, at least, you have a very well-developed public transport system. In cities, you can move more easily without a car than with a car. And the car is inconvenient in many respects, from having insurance to, you know, finding parking. And obviously, there's physical constraints that limit freedom. I think if you want to understand the word freedom, because I've been thinking quite a lot about what freedom really means, I think the only way to really explain this word is what people are interpreting into the car that is ultimately coming from a very different background. I mean, we are living in the West. We have more freedoms than anyone in the world, right? Compared to India, compared to China. We can travel wherever we want. Most people have good incomes. There's no restrictions in terms of borders. We are really free people, yet we feel oppressed. And how can that be explained? And I think a part of the solution towards disentangling freedom must start with a discussion on why we feel oppressed. And there's many inroads, I think, to interpreting this and to explaining why people may feel oppressed. But starting with my own daughter, who is 16 right now, there's a lot of pressure coming from school. I think she's actually influenced for life by this pressure that weighs very heavily on many children and youth, forces them to compete, which is another principle of Western society, competition. And all of that is already a foundation for the types of pressures that people might feel. I mean, there's many. The need to pay taxes, for instance, the need to regularly work. There's so many different ways in which you might feel oppressed that I think this freedom that people demand and strive for has to be interpreted out of this background of emotions that people then connect with the car.
Yeah, so before I give the floor to Jens, so this means that to my second question, that is, if we were able to present people with more and better evidence of the real costs and benefits, this could help? Or do you think that the emotional aspect, at least in our current mainstream culture, is so overwhelming that no matter what evidence you have, we've seen that in many cases. Look at the vaccines debate right now, that even when you have good evidence, solid evidence, it takes more than that to nudge people away from their ingrained emotional reactions. So do you think there is room for initiatives that would strive to put forward better evidence in a convincing way?
Yeah, there's actually some publications that suggest just that, you know, to tell people what the cost of their car is will help them consider the alternatives. Personally, I think it will not work because we talked quite a bit about freedom now, but there's other factors that are emotional. It's also, the car is also a means of sociality. It's a means of rebellion. It's a means of, dealing with anxieties. There's many more dimensions than freedom that make people attached to the car. And for many people, it's part of their personality. And you don't just give up any part of your personality or your personal identity is the word I should be using, without being forced to. So reconsidering the car is difficult for a whole lot of reasons that are non-rational, if you want, in the economic sense.
Thank you, Stefan. Jens, what do you make of this? Emotions. You're a psychologist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that even because you introduced it and says, okay, freedom, but at the end there is no freedom because of all the constraints you mentioned. So, but still, so I think first, so from a psychological point, even the illusion of freedom could be, you know, a value for people. So, and the second one is that all the constraints you mentioned, accidents, congestion, these are all no arguments to leave the car. Yeah, so it's all expected. I mean, for instance, accidents, nobody fears about accidents. I mean, you know this above average effect that, you know, more than 70% of the drivers think they drive better than the average driver. So there is no one fears accidents. If they had an accident, then it changed. So, and also congestion is, you know, is predicted. They know they know it in advance, and in some cases it's already welcomed. You know, the journey to the work in the morning, your podcast or your classical concert, and the congestion prolongs this phase a bit. Yeah, so this is great. If there are things which are unpredicted, then it gets, you know, then people don't like that. So all these things are no reasons for thinking about that. So maybe, so even if it's not real freedom, it's something, at least you have a bit of choice compared to other things, or compared to the public transport, right, where you have no choice. And now, I mean, we will come back to this later. Personal distance is an important issue in these times. You know, I can control this. And also the car has many advantages. And certainly, Stefan said already, we call it extra motives. Yeah, this is, so these are not instrumental motives, but I wouldn't say that they are irrational. No, this is maybe not the correct. I mean, it makes a sense for a person, yeah, but it's something which is not acknowledged in transport models. It's not acknowledged in any model, you know, explaining or predicting travel decisions, because it's so difficult. And certainly, we also, you know, do not have a complete theoretical model which would, you know, cover all the issues which they might be relevant at this stage.
Okay, Stefan, anything to add to that before we move to the next?
Maybe, sorry.
Sorry, I thought
yeah, because of the cost. You already mentioned nudging, and nudging, you know, is, you know, giving incentives to people to change behavior. And one other thing is feedback, because, you know, you act and you are in your car and you don't get feedback about the negative consequences of what you are doing. And I think this, and so I'm a bit, have a different opinion. I would think that if you get the feedback of the costs, of real costs, this would be an interesting information. So people, you know, could consider this. I mean, but the problem is with the car manufacturers, because they have these, you know, environmental driving style models, right? But there you could include this, yeah, so that you really get immediate feedback if you accelerate or something. So very close to your behavior. This is more with regard to safety, but this could have an impact on the behavior, and we have seen this, and there are studies showing that. And but the car manufacturers don't like that. And that's the point. So I think it could be, it wouldn't change the behaviors of millions, but it could have an effect. I'm very convinced.
Thank you. So a slightly more optimistic vision of what could be done to change people's culture. Yes, let's repeat that what we're looking for are measures, policies, or initiatives that would lead to deep and structural changes, and not to simply reactive, apparent behavioral, incremental differences with what the mainstream culture is today. So if I understand correctly, Jens, what you're saying is that it probably takes time, but if we manage to provide the proper feedback, this would, you know, somehow percolate into people's mind and ultimately help changing their basic values and determinants.
Yeah.
Stefan, could you want to add something on this? Can you live with that, or do you think it's still an optimistic vision?
Well, I think we have contributed to a discussion of the complexities, and that rational arguments are weighed against more emotional arguments, perhaps, or to use another framing, there's instrumental car values and you have affective and symbolic car values, and they will always come together when people make decisions. That does not mean necessarily that change is impossible. I mean, we have a great number of examples where people have actually given up driving in favor of most of all cycling, with pretty simple interventions. I mean, there's many examples of companies that have offered a minor kind of incentive to their employees. Sometimes it's even enough to partake in a game where you compete against other companies, and people will start cycling. And the interesting thing here is that for a share of trips, it's possible to break this pattern of habits with simple interventions that seem to work even in the longer term. Because the beautiful thing with cycling is actually that for a great share of those who change from, who make the switch from car to cycle, they will stay with that because they start to realize personal benefits. And these are very often not financial. It's mostly perhaps speed, that you're actually faster in city context than the car, but it's mostly also perhaps perceptions of improved fitness. You feel better. I mean, there's many studies showing that people cycling have better mental health than people driving a car. So once these things kick in, I think it's very, very possible to change behavior. And that then becomes an inroad to questioning the car. But we use the car in very different contexts. And, you know, really giving up the car is a different thing than starting to make a share of trips with a different transport mode. But that we need to distinguish. I definitely think there is ways of, you know, questioning the car and making people using different transport modes.
Thank you. Now, Jens, you wanted to add something? Yes, go ahead.
The cost, because you know, I'm really an advocate of road pricing. I mean, this is about costs, and because most of the costs, you know, as you mentioned, are, you know, indirect costs. They are not visible, and therefore they are not able to steer behavior. So this should be done. I mean, this is very old. This is nothing new. I think this has to be done. And we have seen, for instance, in London, from one day to another, when the congestion charge were imposed, you know, there was a 10–15% decrease in demand in London City. So this, you know, from one day to another, certainly they may changes over time, but there's no flexible policy available than road pricing that could be, and then show the costs, and this would be the feedback for the people. So yeah, because all other things, and this would be because I don't think that the radical shift will be possible because of all these extra motives for people. And I mean, we have seen in the past that very quickly resistance can evolve, right? The yellow vests, also in England, the protesters. So because many people, you know, for them, the car is at the core of the identity. And if then there are, you know, radical changes that could have really big societal consequences.
Yeah, that leads me nicely to my second question, which in fact is a problem within the problem. So driving a car is one thing, but owning a car is a slightly different perspective, and there is a common understanding or belief that one of the reasons why the car is still prevalent is precisely because it conveys some kind of status symbol, and the simple fact of owning a car is a value to which people are not prepared to give up. And there are advocates of the shared economy which are very hopeful and claim that they are right in being hopeful that the emergence and diffusion of shared options is going to significantly change the landscape and the picture with significant improvements in terms of the use of space, in terms of efficiency, in terms of all sorts of nice things and safety, etc. So that's one way of looking at it. Maybe it's a slightly optimistic. It is a promising and interesting signal, but my question is, actually, it's two questions. The first one, will this trend towards a shared use of car be really will make the difference in terms of its sufficiently broad diffusion? And of course, if this would happen, which are the preconditions of changing what I call the soft spots in people values to actually move them towards the higher level of acceptance of shared economy. But my second question, I think, is maybe more critical. Let's assume that this works, that indeed the shared solutions of cars becomes dominant. Wouldn't this ultimately cancel all hopes of the car-free city dream that some more radical, if you would like, but increasingly present people tend to look at as the only solution that would be sufficiently satisfactory? Because if this, thanks to, you know, smart management, ICT, all sorts of facilities, apps, and so on, if a shared solution really take up and become generalized, this would ultimately only serve the purpose of consolidating, of locking in the cities in particular, because this is a specific urban issue, or mostly specific urban issue, into a car-based culture. So this dual issue I'd like to put on the floor now. So will it work? And if it works, do we like it, basically? Jens, you want to start this time?
Yes, I mean, from a psychological point of view, certainly the possession has its own value. And I think this is still, for a broad part of the people, an issue. And this relates again to what we have discussed earlier, control and so on. So all these extra motives, you know, can only be really delivered by possession. So I do not share the very optimistic view that really, in the broad sense, the shared concept will be so successful. There are a lot of areas where it is successful. For music listening and podcasts and so on, yeah, so for the end users, right? And this is very convenient and so on. I'm missing the physical CD or a record cover, yeah. So but most for the young people, I think it's not a problem. And if we look at the success of car sharing, I mean, how old is this idea? It's about 20 years now. Certainly, the new communication technologies makes much more easier to access the services. So certainly this may have an impact, but I'm not fully convinced that, you know, from a psychological perspective, this will the people get out of possessing a car into just sharing a car. So there I would be cautious, and I think there needs more research to be done. Towards the second question, yes, I agree. I think this will sustain that, and I think it's and even, I mean, there are some indications that, you know, in particular with the shared autonomous thing on the horizon, you know, there are many thoughts about that this may generate even more travel and traffic. It could be, but, so this has to be controlled. But then, you know, children and others, you know, could do rides. So I think this would make much more the advantages rise of this concept. So, and I think that's the opposite we want. So it's actually the wrong direction. And then you're still, you know, have the problem to control this by prices, and then we have then again this the social question. Yeah, so that's another point, that because then, you know, many cannot afford it, and then it's, you know, it's perceived as unfair, and then you have something like the social peace may, you know, endangered.
Okay, thank you, Jens. Stefan, what is your take?
Well, I mean, in the introduction, you mentioned all the problems that are connected to the car, but obviously what you meant is they are connected to private car ownership, because the average car is probably unused 97% of the time. So if we had fewer cars, that probably would resolve a fair bit of the problem. The question is, will shared mobilities, car sharing work? I think it's very much a question of the rollout. The city where I live has replaced every 50th car parking with a shared parking, and that has greatly helped to distribute the shared cars everywhere in the city. And the beauty is you can always return, you will get free parking, because, you know, the parking is there for you. And that works very well. So obviously you have a share of people who are willing to switch, who are mostly interested in the transport function of the car, getting from A to B. And for these people, it's convenient to actually not own a car. We shouldn't forget that the average German, for instance, in Germany, 19% of households don't have a car. But in the big cities, 38% don't have a car. So there is something that is voluntary in terms of car ownership, and sometimes the car is simply not convenient. So I think we have a share of people that we can convince. Then there's others who are more personally connected with their car, who have a strong personal relationship with the car, and what I call car driver bonds. And for these people, it will be much more difficult. And here, the important question of autonomous mobility comes into the equation, because as I see it, autonomous mobility could do two things really. One is we give up on private ownership. One extreme pathway is to give up on private ownership, and then to do all the trips by you know, hailed mobility. You press a button on your mobile phone, a car comes to pick you up, and because it's organized through an algorithm, that means that this car that is picking up people and delivering people can pick up another person, and you know, save a lot of transport capacity that way. So people essentially do travel a lot less. And the beauty of that is also because we know that people owning cars drive more than people not owning cars. So there's a very important thing here for breaking up the ownership thing. However, there's also a second scenario that I think is more likely at the moment, which is that we all replace our private owned cars with autonomous cars, which become even more convenient because they will drive without your help. You can watch TV, the congestion time becomes less relevant. All you ever have to think about is when to have the next pee break, because that will determine how much time you can spend in the car before becoming annoyed. And this is the horror scenario to me, because when we also switch to electric mobility at the same time, the problem will be that the car itself will be more costly, but the travel will be cheaper because electric cars have a far lower cost per kilometer of travel because electricity is far cheaper than fuel. And then we have the problem that we probably not only increase and tighten the car bonds that people have with cars because they have their private autonomous cars, but also they will want to travel more because it's so much more convenient and cheaper. And then you have a double whammy that I would consider lose-lose for society, because all the problems that we already have will just multiply. And then dealing with the problem will become much more difficult.
Right. So what about the dream of car-free cities? Is it just a utopian vision that will never be attained? At least
no,
not if
actually, no. I mean, car-free is
or a good approximation, a good approximation of car-free. We can make some exceptions. Okay.
We can make some exceptions. I mean, the southern German Baden-Württemberg Minister of Transportation has actually presented a scenario where he wants cities to have 30% less cars than now in the future. So while this is an exception in at least German transport policies and politics, I think at least there's some people considering an alternative, a different future. And to me, it would be very easy to make that happen, because we know that many people also use cars because they're anxious in traffic. Many people would like to cycle in cities, but they don't dare to because it's noisy, because it's dangerous, because there's pollution. And if we changed cities in very easy ways, or easy to transform ways, to me, that would be the concept of micro mobility streets, where you devote a network of streets to cyclists and other forms of active mobility. No cars allowed. I think you could get rid of a lot of cars overnight, because people would love to use the bicycle, and they would dare to cycle. I mean, in Dutch cities, we have up to 50% of the trips made by a cycle. So there's a lot of leeway in terms of people actually not using cars, but you need to make the, you need to provide the safe spaces that people expect in order to make that switch. And to me, that is not very utopian. It's just a matter of political will.
Yes, you agree with that. Car-free cities out there in what, 5-10 years perspective?
I agree with Stefan that you know, you need a framework for that. I mean, because otherwise, if you just impose costs and everything remains the same, this will, if demand decreases, then it's again getting more advantages to use a car again. You're in this vicious cycle. And so the only way out of it is certainly to reduce the space, and certainly to improve the quality of the infrastructure for the alternative modes. I think at least the cities, at least the biggest cities, have the biggest scope to do it. I mean, there I think is the highest problem perception for the people, and this leads to a rather higher acceptance of policies for mitigating this. And then at the end, then there should be the political will. I think one problem was always that politicians feared to act in accordance with, for instance, the car-free city, because they feared to be de-elected, and that's the point. And now I think you can see it in elections. The Green Party in some big cities or have the majority. So there will come changes, but I think that's a precondition, yes. And then, well, but it will be a hard battle between the two positions. So this will be to come to a car-free city, this will be a very hard way.
Yeah, the role of technology, of course, is important. We already started touching upon this. I wanted to ask a more explicit question on this because clearly we're being sold technological innovation, including, of course, automated vehicles, but not only. I mean, everything which is labeled as being smart, ICT-based, all sorts of apps, traffic, trip planning, and so on. And we're being sold these technological innovation increasingly as the golden pathway to achieve sustainability. This is what we're being told. We're being told that if we want sustainability and sustainable transport, technology is going to make the difference. Now, again, it's undoubted that there are some benefits, visible, measurable, both in terms of economics, in terms of environmental performances, in terms of health, brought about by new technologies. But they actually, again, do not move away from the mainstream assumption, which is that we need to make better cars, better way of moving with cars, but cars. So, of course, I was trying to ask you which are the, what I call the soft spots in the deeply ingrained culture of people that one should tackle if one wants to really move away from this. But there is another element which I would like to put to you provocatively. There's industry behind that. Don't you have the feeling that ultimately is industry that is driving the, sorry to use the term driving because it's maybe appropriate in this case, but who is leading and mastering the pathway in which our transport systems are moving? And all this expected benefits from technology, who is going to really enjoy them? On one hand, we citizens will hopefully be slightly better off in terms of environment and health. On the other, we will clearly help industry to maintain their profit-making activity and increase their profits. Do we need it? Do we really need it? And do we like it? And I know this is a little bit far away, far removed from the issue of individual citizens' values, but it's still a question of values because we have to recognize it. And first of all, the values of industry, and secondly, or even maybe before that, the perception that people have of their interest as compared or sometimes opposed to the interest of other stakeholders, other players in this system. Stefan, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, well, living currently in Germany and being a German, I think I'm entitled to propose that German transport politics over the last 40 years have never been transport politics. They have been industry politics, with the main purpose to advance the agenda of the car industry, which is very important in Germany. And that's a taboo that I'm raising here. Nobody would even dare saying that, I think, in most contexts, because of various dependencies, and also because well, the car industry is very powerful. I think we don't need cars as much as we are made dependent on cars. And that starts with the frameworks that makes us rely on cars. We talked initially about you know, the psychological conditions that make us want cars. We haven't talked so much about anxieties, about feeling exposed in dangerous environments as soon as we leave our homes. I mean, look at the US. I think the mindset is very often that you have to protect yourself when you leave your home. And the car is your natural way of being protected. So there is a lot that needs to be discussed in terms of this function of safety and how that is a mirror of the lack of empathy that we have in many Western societies at this point, that makes people want to protect themselves and use cars. And if you look into the advertisement campaigns that car manufacturers have run, you very often have dystopic views of the future where people drive with cars through exploding landscapes that only the car helps them to escape, where there is messages of, the world going into environmental collapse and the car will help you out. But even the messaging that you've seen at fuel stations, for instance, where there's stickers telling drivers about the high share of taxes that they are paying, which to me is a reflection on the evil state that wants to, restrict car drivers' right and exploits them in the first place. So we have a lot of mechanisms on a very fundamental level that make it difficult for people to question the car, and that then feeds into this process that we experience in statistics, that people buy ever more cars. I mean, Germany is a society that is saturated in cars, and yet we have 1 million vehicles net entering the streets every year. But it's not just 1 million cars net. It's also that the cars are becoming ever more powerful. The average engine is becoming ever more over-dimensioned, really, to be used on streets. They are racing cars very often that people drive. They are not made for transportation. And they are also bigger. I mean, many of the problems, again, to come back to cities that we experience in terms of space, in terms of visibility and accident risks, are related to car volume and mass. And we need to question these processes because, as I said, I don't think it's people's wants, it's rather than the needs that are dictated through the societal structural changes that we experience, and also through the discourses and narratives that car manufacturers use in order to make us believe that we really need these cars.
Jens.
Yeah, well, I mean, this to go even further. I mean, the industry has learned to raise needs they need, and that's certainly a strategy referring to this. I mean, this trend. This is a 40-year trend that cars are getting bigger and heavier and so on. But yes, the other point is that Stefan already mentioned. I mean, but I think it's not only true for Germany, but there are also other countries. So the industry is a very big economic factor. So, and that has to be considered. And also people know that they have good jobs, good paid jobs so far. And this, so I think, and I know from many discussions in local authorities or with local politicians that many politicians consider that in their acting when they decide. On the other hand, I mean, this is a more general issue. Coming back to the technology side, I mean, without going now into the details, but I think that's the point. Technology should help to change behavior. I mean, that's the point. All other things which makes it easier to use something, or even if they are more efficient and have less environmental impact, is again an argument. Well, yeah, the car is clean. I can use it, you know. So everything you invest into make the car better, less environment damaging, you will increase the effect for a pro-car decision. So, and this, as you said, and even then they drive more and so on, and there are a lot of examples there. So there need measures to come from the outside, and that's also, this links also to the shared concept and so on. I think more a fundamental change in the road system, in the infrastructure has to be done to make really a strong move, which is perceivable by the users, by the drivers, to see, well, which means you have to reduce the advantages of the car, finally. And all other things increase the advantages. And there has been the discussion, for instance, priceless public transport. Yeah, you don't, but this is not, it's not an argument for a car driver to move to the public transport. So if you increase the advantages, for instance, of bicycling, this is certainly important, but it's not the main argument for changing or from going away from the car.
Okay, actually, you both mentioned the importance of policy, which is not surprising, but my question is, where do we start? I mean, do we start by trying to indeed convincing people with this or that particular measure that they should change their habits, and do we start by by refusing to be suffering the, forgive me the strong term, but the blackmail that comes out of the confrontation with industry and the jobs and the economic value and the national pride? Don't you have the feeling that we need more courageous policies? There are examples of this at the local and micro level of local administrations who have taken measures which they knew were going to be unpopular and which in the long term proved extremely not only positive in objective and measurable terms, but also in terms of acceptance of people. Don't you have the feeling that our governments, I'm not talking specifically about Germany, but Italy is another case in point because we're big car manufacturers as well, that we are governed by people who tend to concede a little bit too easily to the what I call the blackmail argument, basically related to jobs, but also to, as Stefan was saying, national pride and so on. Who wants to answer this provocative question?
Well, I'm still convinced that, you know, that there is something like, on average, that people, you know, can make rational decisions, even if they sometimes do not. And for instance, I mean, that's the example I often use is the city of Stockholm. Yeah, and they, you know, they had the problem with the congestion and so on, and they, you know, they thought to impose or to introduce road pricing, but they did this in a democratic process. You know, they had they really asked the citizens, and I mean, finally, the majority of the people, at least of the inner city, not of, I think, of the outer city or the suburbs, but they voted in favor of this this policy. I mean, and it showed that, you know, I mean, this was a highly risky policy way that has happened here. And there are other examples like Edinburgh or Manchester where it didn't work. didn't work. But I don't think that, you know, we always ask for these courageous politicians, which now should, you know, like a small dictator or something like that, you know, impose it, and then we say, well, people will then learn, and then they will change their attitudes. This is well, this is difficult, you know, because then it's not thinking about the values. I mean, I'm a bit afraid, but I know that there are the opinions which strictly say this. So, but I think politicians should also more brave with regards that I think what I have said, I see in many European cities a majority of people voting for policies to restrict car use. And I think this could be, well, it depends on the policy, but I think this is very close. I mean, we are not talking about the tempo limit in Germany. So never thought that this would ever happen, but now a great majority, you know, supports to limit the speed on German highways.
Stefan.
I think there's different questions here. One you raised was the question of industry politics. Do you really want to reduce car use because it will affect your industries? And obviously politicians will shy away from anything that will negatively affect the economy. I could also argue that you can see most of the change in countries where they don't have a car industry, like in the Netherlands and Denmark, in Spain, and that probably is evidence that you can move faster when you don't have these lobbies in your back. The other question is, I mean, would people want to change? We've touched on that. I've read a comment here in the Q&A already, if I'm not too taking this too early, but Bernhard Schlag, one is if you're not talking too much about the rational and the instrumental car values. I think we already had quite a discussion in the beginning. I'm not sure if he was part of that, but I would not advocate that policies mainly focus on the sticks, on the restriction of cars. I think that's a very dangerous path to go. Why am I saying this? I mean, we talked about the yellow vests in France, though I don't think this was really about the car. It was about, you know, equity, about justice. And actually, we just did some calculations that showed that, you know, the increase in the cost of fuel hit in particular those that can't afford this additional cost. So I've a great understanding actually for the protest, because in equity terms, that was really not a good strategy forward. And you can also see the Greens, well, they are part of the next government in Germany, but they lost about 10% of the vote that they would have had in May, mostly in my opinion, because they talked about restrictions in the context of air traffic. And it wouldn't have affected even 2% of the population. But you know, Western societies are not reacting well to restricting things. It's something that we don't take easily. That is one thing. And the second thing is then the Greens also talked about increasing the cost of fuel. And again, that was a measure directly against the car, and it didn't go down well with voters. So the question is there different ways to move? And I think that the change would have to come out of cities, because cities is where we can really provide alternatives, where we can connect this to quality of life, where we actually can make people try different transport modes and feel better by using these different transport modes. So I would always think that a strategy that provides incentives and that makes people want change for reasons that they perceive different transport modes as better is a better alternative. And the current situation is specifically difficult because the car now is more legitimate after the pandemic. I mean, we have been asked to protect ourselves by government, you know, and how would you better do that than by driving your car? So at the moment, with this new legitimacy for cars and driving, I think it's more difficult to reboot and to refocus where we've been early on before the pandemic, because we already had a tendency for many cities to restrict cars. Look at Paris. And some cities even have made use of the pandemic again to make other forms of transport more viable. Again, Paris, but even cities like Berlin. So I think by and large, what we need is a more holistic perspective on what's going on. We need to understand why people want their cars, why they think they are dependent on their cars. We also need to understand why they will react very angrily if we take their cars from them, and that can be by proxy. If you remove parking, if you increase the cost of fuel, that means you go not against the car, you go against the driver, right? And that is very important to consider, that this will just result in probably quite violent conflict and resistance. The other way is much better, in my opinion, where we try to incentivize other transport modes, where we also try to create new social norms that actually change perspectives. And the basis for that, to me, is more empathy. We need to start getting out of this box where we have, also because of the pandemic, have been starting to sit. You know, when you are feeling anxious, when you are feeling that society is not treating you well, you start defending yourself and you take what is rightfully yours. You're not in favor of projects that will be good for society. All you can think of is what is good for you. And I think that's reflected in politics, where you see the rise of the far right in many countries at the moment, because people think that they need to defend themselves. You know, it's no longer about what the big projects might be for society. It's just about survival on a daily basis for these people. So the car is connected to more fundamental tendencies that I see in society that we need to counter in order to make to provide a basis for a different transport future. It's not very easy, because there's very different levels here that we need to consider, I think.
Thank you. Yes, well, I would fully agree with you on the diagnosis, maybe a little bit less on the recommendations, in the sense that precisely because people tend to react as if they were attacked whenever there are restriction measures, we should find a way of you know, creating different reflexes. That's what culture is about. The cultural change is one that, when it has happened, it translates into a changing of immediate, you know, default options, of default choices, and of reflexes. And this cannot be achieved by measures that have the obvious result of limiting, restricting, making, penalizing this or that category. And that's what this project is all about. Actually, I remember that when we drafted the proposal, I was using this sentence, this quotation from a French philosopher of 150 years ago, who said that la culture, c'est ce qui reste quand on a tout oublié. Culture is what remains when you have forgotten everything else, you know. So that provides the idea that a cultural change is one that translates in a changing of your automatic reaction, of your default option choices. And again, I fully agree with you that I don't think this can happen by imposing visible restrictions. I mean, maybe these are necessary, and they're necessary to get the ball moving, but ultimately I doubt that these kind of measures alone can lead to structural changes and in changing the deeply rooted, well, for instance, the emotions that you were mentioning a minute ago. So that's an open issue for me, at least, how to actually avoid this inevitable reaction, negative reaction. Look at what happened with the Gilets jaunes in France a couple of years ago. This was about an increase in diesel fuel price, and almost a revolution happened. Because there was no proper communication, certainly, but also no accompanying policies to actually show that this was going in the right direction. So difficult challenge. You mentioned pandemics, and this was my following and the last questions, but actually the question is a little bit broader than that. What I was trying to put on the table is some contradictory signals. At least they appear to be contradictory. At least before the pandemics, there seems to be a trend towards a progressive disenchantment, especially in younger generation with car ownership and with car use also, not only with car ownership. Now then the pandemics arrived and people immediately motivated by other contingent factors, minimizing contacts with others, and therefore going back to driving their own vehicles. But it's not only that, it's also, I've seen some recent polls where this trend, especially in the young generation, towards giving up cars is not so clear. On the contrary, there are quite significant pockets of young generation who do not seem to embrace this disenchantment, and that are still attached to the car. Maybe it's due, Stefan, to what you were saying of the whistles and bells in terms of power, of technological features that make the car more attractive, which again would go back to my previous question, where we are doing it the wrong way. But my question is there an observable trend that can be sustained in the future, looking at what is happening, not only in the pandemics, because of course the big question is, will the signals that are coming out of the pandemics, are they here to stay? Will they consolidate, and is it a definite step back towards more protective or perceived to be protective travel means, or is it something which is somehow transitory and we will resume more positive trends in the coming years? And how can this be combined with these difficult reading of young people aspirations and the perceived needs? So what do we have to say about this? Jens, would you like to start?
Yeah, well, that's several issues. I mean, I think it's still unclear. I mean, the licensing for driver license getting older, yeah. So there is something that people at least that's the impression I have from the literature, that there is a slight change. You can see it also in other value studies, that the youth is more, it's getting even a bit more conservative, in some respects, yeah. So family issues, jobs, and so on. And we put this in the first delivery about the value framework here in this project. Nobody knows it here, but I mean, there is a value change over the lifespan. Yeah, you start more progressive, with more progressive values. You know, you revolt against the adults, and so on, and norms and rules. Yeah, but if you're getting older, you're getting more conservative. Yeah, so this is this can be often seen, but certainly then you know, new generations come, and this might change, but right now it looks even that the youth is getting more conservative to some extent, and this might be that they get a more instrumental relationship to the car in the future. So this could be on the one hand, but we don't know. Right now, it's mainly the elderly, you know, driving the demand. And and they are certainly impacted by the pandemic and the hygienic measures, yeah, which let people, move out of public transport. And I think that's a crucial question. How long will these measures be in place? Yeah, because, and I'm afraid this will maybe go even longer. And I think because this might hinder people to go back. If you look at other areas, I live at the river of Elbe. In the past 20 years, there were 2 very severe floodings. And this has been researched as well, because, that people experience it. They develop big fears about flooding, they protect themselves after the event. And then 5, 6, 7 years later, they, lose it. And, then it's getting normal. And then you don't think about it. Well, after 10 years, you have forgotten it, and people come back. And I think that's, I don't talk about the time frame, but certainly people will go back to when the situation would be normal, and all the restrictions will be back. So this is an interesting point. Through the pandemic, the majority of people accepted severe restrictions because we were talking, people don't like restrictions. With respect to the car, but we have seen that a vast majority of people accepted very, very strong restrictions. So why they did in that case and why they don't accept it in the other case, this could be also an interesting point. What can we learn from the pandemic also for that other for the traffic point?
Okay. Yes, I'm looking at some of the questions that have been formulated by our participants. There's one from your colleague Bernard Schlag. Let me read it out for you. You discuss very concise external values and motives to use cars and how to tackle them. But are cars primarily functional services? What about internal motive to use cars or other self-driven devices? Many people just like to drive. They won't give up driving, even if circumstances are no more as favorable for car use as they are now. Give a boy or a girl a steering wheel and she won't miss it anymore. Would you like to comment on this?
Yes, I agree. I mean, that's true. And I mean, this relates also to autonomous cars. So that's a good question, whether people who like to drive car will like autonomous cars. So this is, I think, still an unclear question. I think there will be some and get out the advantages of, to be driven. But I think many won't do that because they need the steering wheel. And then we are now back again also to the control and the joy of driving. Which is certainly an issue. Yes, I do.
Yeah, but I mean, that was the question. One of the questions I was asking at the beginning. Are we happy with the fact that people like to drive and do not consider that what they need is to move, not to drive? Do we take it for granted? There's nothing you can do about it, and so let's live with the consequences. Is that it, or can we, if we consider it appropriate, both ethically and so on, to intervene for people to give up this passion for driving, which is a nuisance for society? Sorry to be bold and blunt, but I think at some point we have to ask questions. Where are the limits? We don't want authoritarian state. We don't want to impose anything on anybody, but we're talking about ideal situations where people somehow would perceive the need to move as something which is essential, and the need to drive as something which is superfluous, and therefore they can give up for their own benefits and the benefits of society. I don't know how to get there, but is that a reasonable and shareable objective? Stefan?
Well, I think one of the the unfortunate things we need to realize is that societal change is always over decades. It's never something that occurs overnight, right? We see occasional shifts that can be very rapid, inspired by specific events, but normally change takes time. So some countries have realized that, and that is why, for instance, the Danes place a lot of emphasis on how, in particularly, young people move about, how they get to school. And by young people, I mean children, essentially. So the dictum in Denmark is, I think, as soon as you are able to ride a bike, you should ride a bike. I mean, I rode a bike when I was 3, and that worked perfectly for me to get to kindergarten. And I think others could, when others do that, what we get is a change in transport cultures that starts at very early age, and then the kids grow into this process of using different transport modes. Specifically, if you teach them to use bicycles, because that attachment is different than riding a bus, you know, which again is about restrictions in one sense or another. So I think it starts at very early age, where we at the moment have the opposite process, really. We very often see that parents drive their kids to school. We see that the kids already get electric cars to ride as toys. We see that there's discourses surrounded what is cool mobility, what kind of car the father is driving in relation to others. All of that is wrong. It initiates a transport culture that is exactly one that we don't want to have. So we need to see what the obstacles are and look at Germany again. We would love to have small kids riding to school on their bicycles. In cities, virtually impossible, because the police recommends that, you know, up to age 8, you cannot even use the road. You have to, you know, you use the sidewalk. But also, police don't want children to ride to school. The age where police recommends that children will ride to school by themselves is 12. That's far too old for children to go into this transport culture. So we have obstacles here at different levels. Again, this is practical sometimes. It's also, we talked about driving licensure. And prior to the pandemic, I think there was a trend in some countries to actually see a reduction in driving licensure, because, as you said, the information and communication technology revolution has made it possible to use different means of moving that don't require a personal car, that have been far more convenient to many youth in big cities. But through the pandemic, again, you know, with lockdowns and restrictions, you couldn't meet your friends. Again, there's the argument of freedom. You know, you want the car in order to move away from it all if it pleases you, because the state is pressing down on you. So this oppression, I think, is a major factor in the shifts that we are seeing now, that again brings many youth back to actually desiring a car. And also, I mean, young people in Germany now in the election voted for both the Green and the Liberal Party. And that should tell us something about how these shifts can occur because of certain events, even in the wrong direction, and in this case, towards cars.
Thank you. We have a last quick round, which should hopefully serve a little bit also as a summary of the various rich arguments and discussion we've run today. And my question to both of you would be, in a few words, what do you believe to be the up to 3, let's say, most critical factors beyond technological issues? So we are not here to discuss technology, but aspects, factors that have, again, a cultural dimension. Which are the 3 factors which will prove most critical in actually shaping the future role of the cars, or the future non-role of the cars? Jens, want to take this up? You're muted. You're muted.
Thanks. Yes, I think we should concentrate on the progressive parts in the big cities as a starting point. And I think, as I said, I think there I see a considerable amount of people, you know, which are willing to change something. And I think the value is, for me here, certainly it's the environmental argument, which is valid there. Also hedonism, quality of life, because if the car is out of there, I mean, the people, they live there, they get the advantages of that. So it's the quality of life and the hedonism. This would be, for me, the two main values. And the third one, because mobility in an urban context, you know, can be, at least to a great extent, substituted by by cycling. And that's the third one, that cycling has to be improved. And because also, Stefan mentioned this already, the health benefits, which is also related to hedonism or individualism. So this is for me a very positive advantages cycle. These three aspects: the environmental benefits, the personal benefits in terms of quality of life because of living, and the third one, yes, we can substitute by cycling. This is good for my health, and this is good for the environment, and also for the quality of life. And I think there would be the chance something to implement and to lower the demand for cars.
Stefan, what is your basket?
Yeah, it's not 1 to 3 points. It's more of a general, perhaps, proposition. I think we need to, first of all, be aware of the many policies that work in the wrong directions. Jens already mentioned the speed limit in Germany. Actually, it's for decades. There's been surveys in Germany on the speed limit, and a 2/3 majority of the German population are in clear favor of a speed limit. So given the greater accident risks, given the problems in terms of phantom traffic jams, in terms of anger on the road, I think there's absolutely no argument in favor of the current policy in Germany, in this case, to maintain speed limits. And it's very important to move towards 130 and also to follow France in introducing 80 on rural roads and 30 in cities. That is very important. It changes the whole setup of the transport system. It reduces frictions in cities where very often people will not cycle because they perceive it as dangerous to move in car traffic. And where reducing frictions that arise out of speeds will really do a great deal in encouraging people to actually use other transport modes. There's other things, German, again, transport policies, but I think this is also true in other countries, is we don't have a limit for when you have to seize your driving license. Actually, I can tell you many stories of elderly people who have dementia or Alzheimer or other diseases that still can drive. There is no fitness tests. And I think the older you become, the more difficult it will be to actually give up on driving. And at the same time, the older you are, the more vulnerable you are in accident situations. And elderly people also cause more accidents. It's actually the second highest risk group for accidents. So we need to become, in terms of policies, become more open to addressing the taboos, that couldn't be addressed very often because policies work in tandem with what industry wants, and that there's certain voter groups that you can't go against. And this has to change, not obviously in Germany, everywhere. This is also related to the question of subsidies. We, as I said initially, we have just finished calculations showing that the average car in Germany, and this is now a calculation referring to the smallest available car, is subsidized with at least 4,500 euro a year by society in terms of money that is invested into the transport system that is not borne by the taxes and fees that car drivers actually pay. So we have a huge economic argument to actually justify a change in the cost structure of cars. And this is not antisocial, mind you, because very often we push people into indebtedness by suggesting that the car will empower them. It's the opposite, in my opinion. As soon as you have a car, you really have to earn money in order to maintain your car. That really puts you into economic dependency. So to make all of that happen, I think we need communication strategies that are fundamentally different. I talked about the forbidding, about the punishment in terms of cost increases on fuel. I think politicians have to move in better ways. They have to explain to people that it's unfair if the part of society that does not drive cars subsidizes others. I mean, it starts at your local supermarket. If you come by bike, you actually pay for the parking that is provided for car drivers, right? Because we all pay the prices in the supermarket, whether we require very little space to shop there or whether we require a lot of space. So all of this can be packed into communication strategies that are convincing, that will actually make people realize that for good reasons, the system has to change, and it will also be to their benefit. I mean, the best argument for pro-bicycle policies in cities is actually that every bicyclist creates space in the city. So if you want to remove congestion, the best thing you can hope for as a car driver is to actually make cycling more attractive. And this has worked in Copenhagen, where the last survey I read, 70% of the drivers wanted that more should be done for cyclists. So there's many ways of moving this forward. I'm really hopeful. I'm thinking that we don't have the right strategies very often. We don't have the political braveness that it takes. And also we need to disentangle where politicians are actually in bed with industry and don't act to the benefit of society.
Thanks very much. A couple of comments. Take the privilege of moderating this to say the last word. On your second point, you were talking about national pride. Let me for once be proud of my own country on the driving license issue, because in Italy it's a very severe control. Until you're 50, every 10 years you have in any case to renew with a new medical examination. After that it's every 5 years. After that, it's every 3 years, and then every year after 70 years old. So we do that, and I'm not sure it works, but it's certainly implemented. And I can tell you myself, because I'm already on the 5-year regime and close to the 3-year regime. So I'm not particularly happy about it, but that's the way it is. Now, my final comment would be on something which was not raised at all, and to some extent I'm a bit surprised of this, and that's the role of the education system. I mean, if you look at environmental awareness of a young generation, it's really embedded in their basic beliefs and values, at least to a large extent. I can see my daughter, who is not a young girl anymore, but even when she was really young, she had completely different reflexes in terms of environmental behavior, environmental protection behavior. And this is because they started receiving messages in the very early stage of their education pathway, which became inherently part of their, that's what culture is about, at least one of the dimensions of it. So I personally think that a serious I was about to say indoctrination, it's a negative word, but that's the idea. A serious, let's say, information and evidence sharing since the very early stages of a young generation about the whole arguments that we've been discussing today, the real cost, the real benefits, the fact that cycles create space and so on. I think most, if not all, of the things that were put forward today could be translated into pills of education in order to, make sure that there is no trauma in having to give up ingrained values, because the original values are already the good ones when people get old. So I don't know if you want to say a quick last word on this. We have 1 minute to go. Maybe both of you or either of you can comment on this, and then we'll close.
Just very quickly, sorry, Jens. I totally agree. I try to raise this in the context of my example of Denmark and, getting to school very early at the age of 3. All of that to me is part of the educational process. And in many countries, there's also, cycle trainings and things like that. That is definitely extremely important. Sorry.
Okay, well, I have to thank you both for what I believe was a very lively and rich discussion. I hope you both enjoyed it, and I hope our audience also enjoyed it. We'll try to make the most of these inputs we got today in the next stages of our project, and we have to identify the critical factors around which scenarios for future culture mobility changes can be built. We might be getting back to you for feedbacks and comments. Last thing I want to say is that next Thursday we have the last of the series of 5 conversations. It will be concentrating on an issue which was very briefly touched upon today, which is about changing habits of shopping, of interacting with all attractions of our society as a result of both technological changes, societal changes, and currently also the pandemics, of course. So we will be discussing this next Thursday at 4 o'clock, and those of you who are interested are most welcome to join. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much, Jens, and hope to have further opportunities of interacting. Bye, everybody.
Thank you both. Goodbye.